Hi, everybody. I'm Everton de Oliveira from the Groundwater Project. I'm very glad to bring you a new book, very good book. And it's a friend of mine. He was a former professor of mine, a very fun professor, nice to watch the classes, the kind of class that you're looking forward to go. I know that most of them are not the case, but with Doug, that was the case. That was very good. So Doug Mackay is an adjunct professor emeritus, retired from the University of California, Davis in 2017. In 2024, with professors Richelle Allen King and Bill Rixey, he published the Properties of Organic Contaminants. That's one of the courses that I taught at universities based on what I've learned from Doug. So if I'm done something wrong, that's his fault. Just joking, just joking. That was very good. Of course, I couldn't get close to what he was presenting there. So this book is available, and now we have another one available for free for everybody. And the Properties of Organic Contaminants is meant to be used as a reference or even in teaching. Both very good books. And Doug, I'm very pleased to have you here. The new book is a very interesting, like an environmental detective story. Your book, estimating the release of MTBE, a case study. It reads almost like an environmental detective story, solving a hidden mystery about when pollution occurred. Can you share what initially drew you, into the specific case study and what aspect of the investigation you found most compelling or surprising? Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Everton. Well, what drew me to it initially was that I was asked to consider reviewing the case for a client, and because it involved attorneys, I have to keep that all unidentified. But they gave me a brief overview of what the situation was, and it sounded intriguing. So I said, sure, I'd be happy to look at this. Um, and I got my hands on the reports that had been written by both sides of the controversy about who had released this particular contaminant. And anyway, what was so intriguing was it. Nobody seemed to think they ever released it, right? So it's like, well, somebody did, and and
No
the
one
other
to
thing,
blame. That's the
yeah,
thing.
exactly. And the other interesting thing was they had sparse data. They didn't have much monitoring data, but what they had was really clean in the sense it plotted out beautifully. I often uh, have said to people that aren't involved directly in these kinds of studies that contamination incidents like this one are actually just really bad experiments. People didn't bother to keep track of when things were released or how much was released or they didn't
Exactly.
monitor enough and so forth. But still, it can be analyzed in the same way a really good experiment could be analyzed. So that's I thought I'll give it a whirl.
Oh, that's quite interesting. And the most interesting thing is that they agree to put things in place, right? Because usually, uh,
Well, I think there were two owners, and the old owner um, who sold it to the new owner claimed they had never used uh, gasoline containing this compound MTBE. This was a service station selling gasoline and probably kerosene and so on. But they said they'd never used it and or sold it rather. And the new owners said, well, we never spilled anything, although they couldn't say that they didn't sell MTBE containing gasoline. So right off the bat, you've got these two characters, disagreeing and generating tons of consulting reports and so forth. So the question is, well, something's got to be true. You got to dig through all this stuff that everybody's generated and try to figure it out.
interesting, interesting. So MTBE is the central chemical in your case study. It was once used widely in gasoline. You may delve into that a little bit for our readers or our listeners.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah,
But
I think
causing a significant environmental and financial headaches, right? For general
Absolutely.
audience, could you explain why MTBE became such a problematic substance? And what is the real world consequences where what is the real where communities and environmental before it was phased out in 2005?
Right. As you mentioned, it was present in added rather to gasoline starting, I think, in 1979 in the U.S.
Yeah.
and but not everywhere, and gradually phased in various places. And it was originally conceived of as an additive that would improve engine performance, stop the so-called knocking that was caused if you didn't have it. That would lower supposedly air pollution generated by the combustion and so on.
After the lead compounds were banned, right? So they
Right,
used MTBE to
right.
have that effect, but also to an oxygen bearing compound for air pollution, that I understand,
That's
correct?
right. By
Okay.
putting the oxygen in the fuel, you improve the oxidation or combustion of the fuel in the engine. And that all made sense to everybody at the time. It also happened that MTBE was a byproduct of some various processes. So people that had that stuff were happy to sell it. But um, it it achieved some of its objectives certainly. But what I mean, the ones that we talked about as functioning as assisting in combustion and so on. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, it also was extremely soluble in water compared to all of the other components of gasoline. So that if gasoline was spilled, which alas, it often is, um, then MTBE would be leached out of the gasoline into any water, including in the Veda zone, anywhere. And once it got into groundwater, it turned out to be quite mobile.
Mm.
So it moved at essentially the same velocity as the groundwater into which it dissolved. And therefore it's kind of like a tracer of groundwater flow, you could say.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, quite interesting. So in your case study, you highlight how crucial careful interpretation of existing data was, especially when initial reports might have missed key information. What was the most unexpected piece of data or observation that ultimately helped you crack this case? And
Right.
what important lesson does that hold for environmental investigation and data analysis today?
I suppose the thing that struck me the most strongly, that really made me realize how this case could be resolved, was that I started to look at the monitoring data that had been generated by the new owners. And I have a fair amount of experience with gas chromatography, um, uh, and so it didn't bother me at all to look at the details. And I looked at the actual analytical results, what are called chromatograms, that are printed out by the analytical systems. And the chromatogram is essentially a bunch of little peaks that each one is associated with some component that's in the material being analyzed. So if we were analyzing groundwater and we were analyzing for gasoline components, we would see the typical benzene, toluene, xylene, ethylbenzenes as little peaks. So anyway, I looked at the results and I saw an earlier peak, a big one in these analyses. And I thought, well, that's strange. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized it very likely was MTBE, but they were not calibrated for it. In other words,
Oh,
they
yeah.
couldn't tell what it was. So some big peak. They knew it was probably a hydrocarbon of some kind, and they accounted for it in odd ways. But the minute you begin to see those peaks as MTBE, then bang, you know that it was released very, very likely at the
Clearly,
time of
yes.
this monitoring, which was done by the new owners well after they had bought the property. So it was like, okay, there it is. There's the evidence that it was released into shallow groundwater. This was monitoring, 4 feet below ground surface, so around a spill. And the question then just is, can it get to where it ultimately moved in deeper groundwater? And that was the rest of the story, so to speak.
That's quite interesting, quite interesting. But
Yeah,
how did you come up with that? Because why didn't anybody else before you have thought about that? Because they didn't have enough information or what?
I don't, I'm not sure why. I think people, um,
So
particularly at that time, this is a long time ago, um, were not very familiar with analytical methods, tended to trust results from laboratories, just completely, and didn't know that there's some really important questions to ask about analytical results. One of which is, are you sure you've detected everything? And two, do you actually know what everything is? Just because you have a peak, what is it on your analytical result? Um, and then there are other questions related to more complex issues like, could your analytical method even detect compounds that might be there? Because analytical methods are not perfect. So anyway, people were not thinking about those questions, but since I was working with some colleagues that knew a lot about gas chromatography, I had thought about them. And I realized what I said earlier. Whereas other people, I'm sure, just looked at a table and it said, we have these compounds at these concentrations, and that was it. I'm sure they did not look at the original results of the chromatography, the analytical results. And so consequently, that question wouldn't have occurred to them about the mystery peak.
yeah, actually, I remember I first studied in depth chemical analysis and thinking about the how to interpret the information. When I took your course on Waterloo, I think it was 92 or something like that. They were there.
Yeah, yikes.
Yeah. That's probably the year, right? And it is so important. I never forget that, because then I pass that on to students. You have to you have to understand the results, not only accept them as they are, right? You have to see, and then
Right.
in time you get the feeling, I guess, right? You
Right.
you take a look
You
and you get a clinical eye for those things, right? That's probably
right.
why you you are
You
keen.
need to understand what has been reported and what might have been missed. And
Exactly,
I mean, in
exactly.
the case of gasoline, as an example, there's a lot of other things in gasoline over time. I mean, the other kinds of chemicals have been added to them. And until, oh, I don't know, well, at least for a while, it was not realized they were there. And then when people finally thought, oh, perhaps ethylene dibromide is there. And sure enough, it was, because they actually geared up with the appropriate analytical method and could see it.
Exactly, exactly. Interesting,
So,
interesting.
yeah. Anyway,
Well, that if people, since we're talking about that, people that might take a look at your previous book, right? The properties of organic contaminants. We have most of what we're talking about in that book, right? So we can get that from you. I really recommend you guys that are watching this, take a look at the book. It's free anyways. It's very good. I recommend. Okay.
thank
So,
you.
Doc, your book is published by the Groundwater Project, an initiative that emphasizes making complex groundwater knowledge freely accessible to a global community. From your perspective as an expert, why is it so vital for everyone, not just scientists, to understand the unseen world of groundwater and issues like its contamination, please?
Well, I think the first book that was issued by the Groundwater Project has some really good statistics in it, which of course I'm not going to remember right now. But they boil down to the fact that groundwater is an extremely high percentage of the total amount of fresh water that society has available to it.
Yep.
And it needs to be protected, it needs to be understood, it needs to be cleaned up. Uh, in certain cases. And so the decisions and the funding and the impetus for all of those things that I just mentioned are not necessarily scientists. They could come from legislators, public interest groups, the press. We used to run when I was at UC Davis. We ran a seminar program for journalists called Groundwater for Journalists. So these guys could learn, or not all guys, of course, but these people could learn what they should be asking when they were looking at instances of groundwater contamination.
Interesting, interesting. You are correct. Well, you remind me of something when I was, because you having the sessions for journalists. It's quite interesting. We don't have here or in Brazil, but I don't think that is typical anywhere, not even in US. Most people don't care about that by bringing the proper information for the press, and they complain that when they give an interview, experts give an interview, the journalists write everything in a different way. Of course, they don't understand our jargon, right? We,
Right, right.
we talk to ourselves. That's the thing, right? So
But
it's
that's for those of us that are supposedly technically competent, it is our responsibility to communicate what we know in a way that can be understood by the press and
perfectly.
politicians and everyone else that might have a stake in this rather important resource.
I totally agree. Totally agree. So, looking back at this extensive investigation and your career researching contaminant transport, was there a particular aha moment or a discovery in this case that brought you the most professional satisfaction? And for someone just starting out in environmental science or hydrogeology, what is the most important piece of advice you would offer based on your decades of experience, please?
The aside from the business that I mentioned about the analysis and recognizing peaks, the other thing also had to do with peaks, but these were in concentration histories or breakthrough curves, they're called, at monitoring wells. So chemicals will arise, the concentration will go up, and then the chemical will go by and the concentration will go down. So as a function of time, it looks like a peak, and it's called a breakthrough curve. Because those were so clear in the monitoring data, it occurred to me they could be interpreted as a tracer of groundwater flow velocity, which it was true because MTBE does in fact act like a tracer. It is not heavily involved with the geologic medium it's moving through, excuse me. So that alone is fine. You can estimate a time of travel if you knew where it came from and if you knew when it was released. So, of course, they were arguing over when it was released, and I thought it was probably around the time that those chemicals were determined in the shallow groundwater. So the aha moment was realizing that with three different wells, I end up with three different peaks, which allow me to estimate some equations that define the travel time that have an unknown in it, namely when was it released. But because they're different peaks at different distances, you can solve those equations as simultaneous equations and get an estimate of the release date, or actually the release time after these peaks. And once I had that, and it was amazing how well it worked. Then I knew, okay, very likely it was released around whatever date it was, 1986 or something. And maybe it was, I don't know what it was. It's in the book, but it just was kind of amazing how well that
Yeah,
worked.
don't spoil the readers. Let them read. Let them read.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm talking about. Is this, as I mentioned earlier, these contamination cases are basically just very poor experiments. Somebody released something, and in our experiments, we would very carefully do that, and then we'd monitor very carefully where it got to, so we could make calculations regarding the travel time and that sort of thing. And it just turned out to be possible to do that with these monitoring data from a case study.
That's fair. That's quite interesting. So what is your piece of advice if you have one based on your experience and for people? One of the things that I have my personal opinion on talking to you. It looks like it looks, and it sure does. like I said, that you have fun doing stuff because you like what you're doing, which is
Yes,
important in our work life, right? Otherwise, it's boring. Okay.
that's
So,
right.
what's the most important advice you do to people to at least
Well,
get close to your happiness in working in this field?
yeah, I think you just answered the question in a way, which is, you know, if you're not enjoying doing this, stop. Think
You're
of it
right.
as a puzzle that you're trying to solve, and it gets interesting. And
Yes,
it's like, okay, I know there's an answer in here. There has to be, right? The chemical was released at
to be a
some
logic.
time. When was that? And the question is whether the information you have is sufficient to answer that. So it becomes intriguing to try to sort that out. That's the general comment. The more detailed comment is, as we started, examine the assumptions behind everything. All the analytical methods, could they possibly have missed something? If you're looking at a project, is there some way there's a set of chemicals or a set of properties that nobody's even thought about? Um, but most importantly, I would say when looking at groundwater contamination, avoid looking at aerial data because a lot of times people just want to plot how big a plume is and they don't have very many data points. So they end up with a weird looking, oval thing. You don't really know where the edge is. And you don't care in a way. You do in a way. That's what uh, everybody cares about. How far did it go and all that stuff. But the more insightful way to look at it is to look at the temporal history, the history over time of concentration changes at various places. And that can often tell you a lot. And that was the breakthrough on this case.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very, very, very nice. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a great enthusiast of publishing case studies. Case studies are a great way for us to compare different way of thinking or interpretations and learn from real world, right? Because just getting the concepts.
Right.
When you go to the field, you're you're stuck in a puzzle, like you mentioned, right? And
Yeah,
you have to
exactly.
solve it. That's the fun of it. But then you learn from different stories and different case studies. So congratulations again for putting this together. Please make your final considerations and again, thank you for putting this nice work together for us to read.
It was a pleasure to do it. And it's a great thing to talk to you, Everton. I appreciate that time.
Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you. And guys, please go to the website. It's for free. Just download the book. Have fun reading that. If you're a hydrogeologist, you do enjoy reading the book and learning from Doug's experience. Thank you, Doug. See you.
You're welcome.